Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab podcast. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph, and today on this episode, we have a very, very special guest. Her name is Chandra Taylor-Sawyer. She is a senior attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center. Chandra, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So I have a little bio. I want to read it for our listeners because I want them to really feel who's joining us today on this podcast. So I'm going to read it. It's pretty extensive. Chandra is a senior attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center and leads its environmental justice initiative. For nearly 2 decades, she has worked to confront the disproportionate burden of pollution borne by communities of color and low-wealth neighborhoods across the South. That's the South in the United States. We have an international audience. For those of you listening outside of the U.S., in the southern part of the United States, she is a leader in fighting for environmental justice in that area. Her legal career spans water quality advocacy, industrial hog operation reform, and litigation to clean up toxic waste sites, always with a focus on protecting public health and elevating community voices. Since 2016, she has also served as an adjunct faculty member at the University of North Carolina School of Law, teaching environmental justice law, policy, and regulation. Chandra has been recognized nationally for her leadership, including as an Audubon Together Green Fellow, and she currently serves on the boards of the University of North Carolina Institute for the Environment, the Greater Triangle Area Chapter of the American Red Cross, and the National Environmental Education Foundation. She is also a North Carolina native and a graduate of the great University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. That is who we're talking to today, in case you're wondering. And so it is my honor and privilege to spend this time with you on the podcast.
Mine as well, Dr. Leslie.
So thank you for being with us. What I like to do with all of our guests, especially distinguished ones, is learn about their background, where they came from, how they got into this environmental justice world, and how they ended up where they ended up, whether it's an organization, a university, a nonprofit. And so tell our listeners about your upbringing, about your background, how you got involved in environmental justice. Was it an event, a circumstance, a situation, just observing things, and just go from there?
Absolutely. So my interest in environmental justice work really stems from two things. First, it has been a lifelong desire of mine to engage in ways that help create a level playing field for everyone. It's been present in my mind. And the triggering event that I think back to was growing up in the 90s and seeing the end to South African apartheid. So I was in college and I saw what was happening across the world. I saw this nation come to a point where it was going to eradicate what had been basically legalized racism in an entire nation. And they came to that point with a combination of international pressure, organizing of people in that nation, long term advocacy of extraordinary leadership. I think we all heard about what Nelson Mandela was able to do in that nation. And even though it was on the other side of the world, from my perspective, I felt like I was seeing like a unveiling of their civil rights movement. So I wasn't born yet when the United States was going through the civil rights movement. But in the 50s in the United States, we saw the end to segregation with Brown v. Board of Education. There were so many laws passed in the 50s that were meant to help create a level playing field for people in this country. There was, we saw the end to Jim Crow. There was the passage of the Fair Housing Act. In the 60s, we saw the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And all of these things I know about because I was reading history. I wasn't there to experience those things firsthand. But as a freshman in college, I was able to see like, this is their civil rights movement. This is so motivating. And I think that part of what I'm going to do with my work as a human being, as a person, is to help create a level playing field for everyone to live the lives that they envision for themselves. Um, so I've always had a very strong interest in social justice. I feel like I had a lot of support for my pursuits, my exploration of African American history, of African
Mm-hmm.
history. I'm from Kinston, North Carolina. I went to a predominantly Black high school. I felt like I was really encouraged to look at, what can be done for an equal playing field. What can be done to have equality for everyone? What can I do to contribute to that? My grandmother was the cafeteria manager. She was the a woman who was doing what I thought also was helping create a level playing field. She was providing food for
Mm-hmm.
elementary school students, and I loved going to see her every day. But she was also providing an example of a person who was engaged in civic life. She, participated in making sure there was food for people during the holiday season. She had so much to give, and I got to, have a mentor in that regard, like somebody who was always looking out to help her community. So that has been one of my lifelong interests. And then I'm also a person who was always interested in science. I said if I went to a smaller university, I probably would have become a scientist. I am a very strong supporter of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It is a huge school. So I started out at Carolina thinking that I would be, a scientist, a physician, and all of my acumen that so far in science, it did not stand up to the test of college. Um, so I said, let me lean into my strengths. What is it that I am good at? And, research, writing, advocacy were areas that were a more natural fit for my skill set than to continue in the hard sciences, but that didn't diminish my interest.
Mm-hmm.
So interest in social justice, interest in science, those things both led to a career seeking to achieve environmental justice. Now, before coming to Southern Environmental Law Center, I actually practiced consumer protection law. So I did that for 5 years before transitioning to Southern Environmental Law Center and practicing environmental law. And I went into consumer law practice because I was like, this is an area of social justice. This is about economic opportunity. It's about making sure that people are not preyed upon with predatory loan products, with predatory credit cards, even looking at making sure that people didn't have predatory rental lease agreements for their home. And I said to myself, this is where I think that I will have a really meaningful impact to people who I feel like I see and I interact with every day. And that was my choice. My first, I was entertaining coming out of law school, international human rights, environmental law, or consumer financial protection. But I spent 5 years in consumer financial protection. And then around the time where I recognized that our national banking laws were actually prohibiting consumers from actually getting ahead. That
Mm-hmm.
I was observing. I was like, we represented lots of people who were facing foreclosure. There was a strong uh, North Carolina Anti-Predatory Mortgage Lending Act, we were bringing these cases, but we were getting preempted by a national banking act that was actually protecting lenders and not making lenders actually do right by consumers. And I was like, this is an uphill battle. And until we have some reform with our national banking laws, with consumer financial protection, this is going to be a area that I can't do what I think I am. I can't provide the assistance or the relief that I think should be possible. And I started looking for what I would choose to do next. And I said, okay, what is next on the horizon for me? And I heard on NPR about the work of Southern Environmental Law Center. So in 2006, SELC was involved in litigation to improve air quality in the Southeast. And I was like, this is an organization that is well resourced enough and that has an intention that is about protecting public health that I know will actually be remarkably effective in helping achieve environmental justice. I was like, SELC might not be calling the work that it does environmental justice work, but I was like, an organization that's based in the Southeast, which is SELC is based in the Southeast, that is really intentional about making sure that everybody has a healthy environment is a place that I think that I'm going to be able to grow and do this work of achieving environmental justice. And there was a position open at SELC. I applied for a lateral move at 5 years of practice and made the case about how my experience thus far would translate into practicing environmental law. And certainly, I do think that my passion for the work was probably more in depth than my exposure to bedrock environmental laws. But I didn't think that that was going to create a barrier in me having extraordinary impact along with people who I already considered extraordinary. I was like, these people doing this work, they're going to do amazing things. I'm going to be able to do amazing things with them. So that's my path to practicing environmental law and practicing environmental law to achieve environmental justice at SELC. And I have been at SELC 19 years at this point.
Wow, 19 years. A couple of questions. You mentioned at the beginning that seeing what happened in South Africa was one of the things that really motivated you to do the work that you're doing now and really pushed you in the direction that you're going in, that you've gone in, which is kind of surprising to me because looking outside. So, first of all, I know when I was younger, I didn't really pay much attention to world affairs, global affairs. I was very much in my own little bubble in South Carolina, where I'm from. And so to hear you talk about how you watched and saw South Africa's kind of civil rights movement, their push to end apartheid as a motivating factor is really interesting. And I wonder why that didn't take you on an international kind of trajectory, looking at other parts of the world or other parts of the, hemisphere that may have been in need of that same kind of liberation. Because you mentioned, okay, the US, we had our civil rights movement, we ended segregation. I call it American apartheid here, and moved through that. You see South Africa, and I would think you would say, oh, I wonder where else in the world these civil rights need to be realized. But you stayed in the South, working in the South. That's interesting. I would love to learn more about how that in your mind played into what you're doing. And I'm also interested in the transition from consumer protection law to environmental law. Was that a hard shift? I always hear from lawyers how certain types of laws is pricing law this way is not like the other kind. So you can't just go from criminal to administrative and from consumer to environmental to trial. And I don't know if they're trying to just tell me that because they want me to know how specific their particular field is, or if it really is like a hard lift to transition from one type of law practice to something that from my perspective, seems to be totally different. What was that like for you, and how did you navigate that shift toward environmental law?
So I'll start with the decision to keep my focus more domestic, even
Mm-hmm.
though my motivation came from actions that I saw happening, across the world. So we still see that even though we saw the end to segregation in the United States, that hasn't resulted in the gains that should have been realized with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the passage of the
Mm-hmm.
Fair Housing Act, with the end to Jim Crow. I mean, it is still a fact that Black communities, Black families are 75% more likely to live in close proximity to polluting facilities than white families. It's still true that there are enormous wealth disparities in the United States between Black and Hispanic families and white families. It's still true that with maternal health, Black mothers are far more likely to die related to pregnancy complications than white women. The
Mm-hmm.
fact is though even though there should be a great deal of progress, there has not been enough. So it I was I'm still, very interested in what happens across the world, all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
But from my perspective, there was a great need for actions that I could take in the United States. Like, we haven't come as far as we need to come in terms of social justice aims, social justice ends for, all of our people. So that was, I did consider international human rights. I really loved my clinic in law school. I really enjoyed working on asylum cases, doing work to, help people who were fleeing violence in their own country. I thought that was important work, but from my perspective, I was like, how can I have the most impact? How can I engage directly with people right where I am? And that choice to go into consumer financial protection law and then to remain in environmental law in the United States, it was motivated by me envisioning having a greater impact here domestically. But I will also say that my transition to environmental law also had to do with the fact that a scheme to actually protect the environment, to set up regulations that are protective, that actually has international application. Though,
Mm.
the way that we determine, like, we have permits to pollute. That's how our environmental protection system exists. To limit certain pollutants, actually, it is quite protective. I did spend time in China with an exchange program that was sponsored by the Department of State and the Woodrow Wilson Institute. I did that with the Vermont Law School Environmental Justice Exchange Program. And I remember being in Beijing and trying to exercise outside and feeling like an asthmatic. And
Mm.
and I'm not an asthmatic. Like, that's not something that, like, thankfully, even though African Americans are more likely to suffer from asthma than white communities, often because of the proximity to polluting facilities, um, that's not something that I had experienced before going to China. And their environmental protection system is younger than ours. But it really brought home to me, like, here's how our permits that limit the amount of pollutants that can be released actually help us. Because I was in a situation where I was like, they have a young system. The regulations were not working appropriately, and it was hard to breathe. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but so that was just an example of, I feel like I do get some taste of international application of the work in the practice of environmental law, but still am very interested in being working stateside because we have so far to go. And then on the question of transitioning from consumer financial protection law to environmental law. Um, I do think it is a heavy lift, but I don't think it's an impossible lift. And I would tell anyone that when you are very motivated to do something, you're willing to put in the work to do that lift, especially if it's not beyond your capacity. Like I realized I wasn't going to
Mm-hmm.
become a chemistry PhD, but I could become an environmental lawyer. I don't have to understand all of the science. I need to understand some of it and I need to consult with an expert to go, the final mile. Uh, I think so. I think that's the short answer to the question. It is a heavy lift, but it's not impossible, especially when you're very motivated to do work in a particular practice area. I think it's just taking the time to do it, deciding what you need to study, consulting with the right mentors, consulting with the right sponsors, taking the additional courses, and doing the
Mm-hmm.
work.
Nice. Very nice. So now you're at the Southern Environmental Law Center. You've been there for 19 years. And from what you said earlier, you wanted to go there because of a story you heard on NPR talking about its work. And so now that you're there, what would you say is the mission of the SELC? What are they trying to do, and what is their major push and initiatives throughout the center? Because I'm curious. The reason I'm asking is because in the South, especially, and I'm sure across the country too, but in the South, there's so many issues, so many problems. And when I read about a company, an organization called the Southern Environmental Law Center, it gives me the impression that they can't possibly be doing all the things that I would think an environmental law center needs to do because there's too many issues. And so I wonder if there's any particular focus area, any particular driving mission that you kind of are dialed into that's specific to the law center that you could tell us about.
So, right now, I'm dialed into leading our environmental justice initiative. So, we have done work that I think is consequential toward improving public health, toward protecting the environment for Southerners, for people in the Southeast, for almost 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
The Environmental Justice Initiative was created in 2021. So there was an intention of leadership of the organization to put a thumb on the scale to actually do more in terms of representing, partnering with the most overburdened communities in our region. That the South has created problems and that the South can actually help solve problems. And some of those problems relate to systemic racial injustice.
Mm-hmm.
So our leadership put environmental justice in our strategic plan. And I was asked to make sure that we were carrying out these objectives. So I am dialed in to doing that. And I think you're absolutely right. Your perspective is in that there are so many issues. Certainly, we cannot cover all of them. However, I would say with the Environmental Justice Initiative, one of the things that we seek to do is to listen to people who are frontline to environmental harm, listen to the most vulnerable communities, listen to communities of color about what issues are front of mind, are causing the most harm for them. And that actually helps direct how we allocate the resources that we have as an organization toward the ends of reducing those burdens, of preventing additional harm. So while we can't do everything, we do partner with communities who are frontline to find out what are the most pressing harms. And we've heard over and over again about issues, that zoning issues on the local level, that comes up so frequently. So many decisions about whether a polluting facility is going to be able to site in close proximity to a residential community that has been disinvested in and thus is more attractive to a industry because it's cheaper land near this disinvested a community that's been that disinvested in, the decision about whether that facility can site near a residential area, that's a local zoning decision that comes up. So we've chosen to engage in some issues related to zoning and land use. That is right there in parallel with our land and community program. We also do research about what does the data show are the issues that are causing most harm. And we looked at air quality data in our region and recognize hotspots, pollution hotspots in Mobile, pollution hotspots in northern Birmingham, pollution hotspots in Memphis. And we have been able to partner with organizations that are working to alleviate those harms. And our staff, our attorneys, our geospatial staff, are engaging in work to improve air quality in those same areas. So we have, as an organization, just as a matter of fact, 6 program areas and 2 cross programmatic initiatives. So the Environmental Justice Initiative is across all our programs. The Climate Initiative is across all of our programs. But we also have attorneys working on forest, wetlands and coast, water, air, energy, and then land and community, which is really looking at transportation, zoning issues, responsible development and growth. So you're right. There's so many issues. There are always more issues than there are attorneys. There's more issues than there are actually laws to protect against harm. But we focus our work through the lens of our programs and our initiatives. And the Environmental Justice Initiative is really looking at all of our program areas and saying, how do we actually reduce harm in these areas for communities that are most vulnerable, for communities of color, for low wealth communities. So you're right. There is a lot to do, but we do have our own internal prioritization, and we are listening to what our partner groups say are the most pressing harms.
Nice. I want to drill down a little bit on the issue of zoning just for a second, because I know for me, I mean, I'm in the academic space, and so collecting data is what we like to do. So water quality data is always something we look at, and air quality data, and you know, infrastructure quality, things that we can collect, that we can visibly see and touch and report on. And it's always fun for me to do that. But I think this issue of zoning is something that we really don't talk about in the academic world, but it seems like it's a really, really big issue and a really, really big concern. And the way it was explained to me was a big corporation comes with the desire to build a facility somewhere. They pick the cheapest, lowest income area, and there's a vote to determine if they'll be allowed to build there. And usually they sell them on economic development, job creation, and voila, the council agrees and they vote to allow that facility to be built there. And what I'm always told is, oh, we need people to, come to those meetings and raise their voices and tell people how they feel, how they be impacted, and raise concern about these places coming to their communities. But essentially, in the end, it's the people voting that would be the ones who determine whether or not a facility gets placed there. And that's how it ends up going. First, is that a fair characterization? And two, if it is, where does a law center get involved there? Because it does feel very much like a public comment conversation with elected officials making the final decision, apart from any other kind of influence. And so how does the SELC enter into those kinds of conversations, those kinds of concerns, and exert, I don't know if it's legal pressure, if it's like advocacy pressure, to try and prevent those harms from coming to those communities?
So we are going to use whatever tools are in the toolbox to help get to the ends that our clients and partners are seeking to get to. And I do think that your characterization, I think it's spot on in terms of how decisions get made. I would also add that pressure from an organized public is extraordinarily meaningful. Pressure from an organized public in the public comment process does have outcomes that can be very favorable to a community that's advocating for an outcome that's different than what seems to be on the table. And so, when we engaged with a community in Savannah, Georgia, that it was a residential community that was in very close proximity to a vehicle transfer station. So basically, it's a residential community, but there was a auto import company that was basically bringing cars in and out of this residential community. So in commerce, and the community was really disturbed about the amount of traffic that was created by this facility being in a residential neighborhood. They were concerned about the condition of some of the vehicles and what impact it would have on the actual physical environment of this neighborhood. And there, we actually helped in a communications capacity for that community. So they wanted to have press conferences to pressure the local zoning authority to actually penalize the auto export facility to penalize them for violations of local zoning regulations. And we provided communication support. We provided help with yard signs for the protests associated with it, with talking points for the community, with their press conference, and with research that supported that facility was actually in violation of the local zoning ordinance. So actually getting the regulators to come out to the community and cite that facility for violations of the local zoning ordinance. So that's one example. And I mean, the outcome eventually got to that facility moving out of that community, or promising to move out of that community. So, that is one of the ways to get involved, is with, communications by an organized community that has recognized when, there's somebody in the neighborhood that is violating the local zoning ordinance. In terms of facilities that might be trying to come in, there have been engagements where, we are recognizing, the local zoning authority, they're not complying with public notice. So public notice that says, you have to advertise that you're going to vote on this change in zoning that would allow this particular polluting facility in. So we're on the lookout for that. Did the local zoning authority follow its own rules? And if they don't, then we're prepared in those situations to actually, file a lawsuit to ask them to not proceed with the vote. So those are just two examples of how to get involved. But it does take an organized community to actually raise the flag. And the organized community is going to be most influential to the zoning authority, the planning commission, the board of county commissioners, whoever is making those zoning decisions. I mean, there are certainly situations where, where pleas of the community fall on deaf ears, but there are also many instances where opposition to placement of a new data center in Virginia, like that, it doesn't go forward because of organized opposition of people who are concerned about what it would mean to see a data center set up in their community. So I do think you're right. And I do think that organized pressure, understanding what the laws are, understanding what the rules are, can influence those processes. But it is absolutely true that zoning issues actually end up creating environmental injustices
Yeah.
over and over again.
No, absolutely. And that's what I I'm being told more now is the kind of thing that we should focus on in terms of stemming the tide of environmental injustice versus trying to look for specific instances of pollution or specific areas that are kind of degraded, like the way cities are laid out, the way they're planned, the way facilities are sited, the way those areas are managed by the city itself becomes almost a much bigger issue than just whether or not the water is clean or the air is clean. And so I've been thinking about that a lot. And it's good to know that this kind of organized opposition can really yield positive results and really shift the, I guess, like a better word, environment that people are experiencing where they live. Just a quick question. What does SELC consider the South? Because you mentioned Virginia. Is that South?
For SELC, it's the South.
Okay. So what does it cover? What does it cover? What's the
So
South?
we SELC works in North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, Virginia, and Tennessee. And we also have an office in Washington, D.C. Our federal affairs team is in Washington, D.C., because we are also engaging with members of Congress
Mm-hmm.
and engaging with the federal executive and agencies regarding environmental protection, improvement of public health in the Southeast. We primarily work in those six Southeastern states, though occasionally we engage in matters outside of the six Southeastern states. Sometimes there are matters of national significance. Right now, we're engaged in two federal funding freeze cases that have clients from outside of the Southeast. That work is specifically about making sure that these groups that are doing work to improve the environment, to improve public health, to provide food for people in need, that they actually get the funding that Congress allocated and said should go to those communities to do that work. And those are two cases of national coverage. But those are
Okay.
those states are the states in which we primarily work.
Okay. And I cut you off earlier. What were you going to say?
And it was in terms of influence that people can have in the planning and zoning process. I just was going to mention the our new multimedia storytelling project, Plantations to Pollution, Black Communities, Legacy Pollution, and a Path Forward, that I am very hopeful that people will take the time to go to that webpage. It is a wonderfully, it's visually stunning, and the information is incredibly helpful in connecting past harm to current injustice, and actually being able to show a through line from how, in zoning situations, how historic disinvestment has resulted in neighborhoods that are in need of help, that are in need of decisions that actually support them to improve their environment, that historic injustice has made it more difficult for them to get ahead today. And one of those stories is in the Berkeley community, the Berkeley neighborhood in Norfolk. And that's a community that had been disinvested in, and when it came time, and it has flooded over and over, like there are issues with flooding in that community. So in terms of like looking at what are the environmental issues, well, the local authorities that needed to make a decision about how do we shore up this community so that they don't have these flooding issues. Well, before intensive organizing by that community, there was a decision made that, that basically acknowledged, oh, the property values are just so depressed in this community that it would actually cost more to protect it from additional flooding than what the value of the property actually is. Well, it was like pressure from people in that community to say, like, here's why these property values are depressed, and we are still a community and we're still in need of being protected. So in the same way that these local decision makers are going to protect other areas of Norfolk from consistent flooding, the Berkeley community needs that as well. And their organizing and their advocacy did get them included in the plan for protection from flooding. So, I mean, I think, that's one of those instances of there is a particular like environmental harm, which is, there's, climate change driven flooding and flooding that relates to, systemic disinvestment or even granting low lying land to people, Black communities who were seeking to have somewhere to live post enslavement.
Mm-hmm.
There are the environmental issues, but there's also these planning and zoning decisions about, and, local municipal decisions about, well, what do we do to actually alleviate this harm? And that's one of those local decisions that, by organizing, by putting pressure on decision makers, showing them about the past, enlightening them about the present, that they actually got a result that is favorable and that is about protecting that community from future flooding. So it's just an example to follow on to what you were saying, and a mention of a really great project that I think is illuminating in a lot of ways, and that Plantations to Pollution is it allows people to make the connections between prior harm and current injustice, and then determine, like, it helps motivate people to determine what action do they want to take.
That's exactly right. So you're the leader of the Environmental Justice Initiative. What else are you involved in or that you're engaged in that is really exciting? Because the Plantation to Pollutions project does seem very exciting and really invigorating for communities. I wonder what else you're working on or what you're planning on doing, looking forward with the initiative that really gets you up and really gets you motivated each morning.
Well, I have to say, like, I'm really grateful that there have been so many arenas for me to expand on this work of achieving social justice in a place that means so much to me. I started out, I came into the practice of environmental law, focusing on water, transitioned to doing more work in transportation, public transportation, and looking at where trying to prevent road projects that were going to be extremely devastating and not that helpful, and determined that I want to have regional impact. And being at SELC, I've been able to do that. Like, I'm licensed in the state of North Carolina, but we can practice in any other state through the Pro Hoc BJ process. But things that we're doing right now, I mean, a lot of the work that we're doing is response to the current federal administration. It's really
Mm-hmm.
playing defense and protecting the laws that we have on the books, that are meant to create a more level playing field. So there's, again, the federal funding freeze litigation. There is work to actually do all that we can to prevent repeal of civil rights regulations that have been of assistance to communities and helping achieve environmental justice. But those regulations they're in peril. So part of what we do is participate in the public comment process to put in the record, here's why these regulations are still necessary. Here's how we see that permitting decisions actually have the effect of harming Black communities and other communities of color more. And because those decisions have the effect of this greater harm, these communities need to have these regulations remain in place so that they can actually file complaints about those decisions. Um, I think there's some more things that are exciting, but I wanted to pause because you might have had a follow up.
Yeah, I do. So I didn't realize that there was. So what you just said was you're on the front lines helping to avoid the repeal of civil rights legislation, which is something I have not heard yet. And so I do want to know, what is this legislation that's being repealed or being attempted to be repealed? Like, what are we talking about? Because civil rights seem to be very basic and very foundational to how our society functions. So what are we in danger of losing?
So the Civil Rights Act of 1964
Mm-hmm.
does a lot of things, but one of the things it does is it prohibits discrimination in the use of federal funding. So any
Yes.
entity that receives federal funding is prohibited from discriminating in how it's used.
Mm-hmm.
In the environmental context, and let me say, like pretty much all the federal agencies have or had their own offices of civil rights. And the ways that people are able to actually get action underneath this statute, they can either make an allegation of intentional discrimination, or they
Mm-hmm.
can make an allegation of discrimination that's basically disparate impact. They make an allegation that the actions of the federal aid recipient had the effect of discrimination, that it wasn't intentional, but it had the effect. We have regulations that allow for complaints based on that. Those regulations
Right.
are those regulations are in peril. We are at risk of losing those regulations. There have been executive orders that direct our attorney general to actually do away with these regulations. We expect that federal agencies will one by one start the repeal process for these regulations. And I do think that it is unlawful to repeal longstanding regulations by the process that is being proposed.
Right.
And of course, we are also not at the point where we've achieved equality, that we've gotten to the we still need the regulations to be on the books,
Right.
and it is very difficult to prove intentional discrimination. But it is also the case that there are actions of federal aid recipients that have the effect of discriminating. So but those regulations are in peril, in the same way that efforts to encourage diversity, equity, and inclusion, like that, those
Mm-hmm.
efforts are also they've been attacked, and in many instances uh, removed. Like there are many states that just went ahead and started, engaging in their own legislative processes to go after any efforts to encourage or support diversity, equity, and inclusion in many, many different arenas. So, those are two examples.
Yeah, but it was my understanding that, so during the last administration, there was a big push for environmental justice. Lots of funding, lots of initiatives, big, grandiose displays of solidarity from the Office of Environmental Justice and Civil Rights. I remember reading all those things, talking about it on the podcast. And my point was back then that executive orders are easy to undo, and that in order for things to really be firm and reliable, it needs to be passed as a law. And so all the executive orders that Biden did, Trump came in and just literally just undid them, like control, all, just reversed them. But I just assumed that if we had a law, you can't just no longer have the law. You can't executive order the law away. And an agency can't just disregard the laws without Congress acting or without some kind of legislative process or some kind of Supreme Court decision, I guess, that deems the law unconstitutional. There's no other way to come out from under these laws. So the idea that any agency would just decide not to obey that law anymore seems ridiculous and clearly illegal. And so are you having to fight those kinds of battles and convince the EPA that it needs to continue to obey the law that's on the record since 1964? Is that what we're doing?
That's what we're doing. So, Executive Order 14281. This executive order defines United States policy to eliminate consideration of disparate impacts. It directs the Department of Justice to appeal or amend civil rights regulations and to look for similar rules at all other federal agencies and in states. It directs all agencies to deprioritize enforcement of all statutes and regulations to the extent that they account for disparate impacts. So it is an executive order. Executive orders don't have the force of law, but they can encourage action or chill action. And this is a executive order that has resulted in deprioritization of enforcement of civil rights laws. And at the same time, one of the things that has happened is that with EPA, whole environmental justice, the Office of Environmental Justice has been dismantled.
Yeah, it's gone.
Right. So the staff that would need to be there to actually do the work, that staff has been removed. So yes, I would, the law still exists. Someone should still be enforcing them. DOJ should still enforce civil rights laws. What the situation that we are in right now is that a administrative complaint can be filed to actually enforce our civil rights law. And what happened in Louisiana is that there was a challenge to the legality of the regulations themselves when a civil rights complaint was filed. And the result of that litigation has meant that in the state of Louisiana, those regulations cannot be enforced. So the next level up would be, there could be a decision by the Supreme Court that would be even more, it would have a wider application than the state of Louisiana, than the application to the state of Louisiana. The fact is that though, the law is still on the books. There's only been one agency, the Department of Energy has moved to repeal these regulations by a process that we have alleged is an unlawful process.
Yeah, they can't though.
Well,
can they? Oh, they're arguing that they can.
Right. This is part of the work of defense and maintaining what we have on the books, of recognizing when the next agency attempts to repeal the regulations, because they do still exist. It is only in Louisiana where these regulations cannot be enforced, but it's something that's just one of the arenas that we are working in to do all that we can to make sure that existing laws are able to be enforced in the future.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I didn't realize that, so I'm glad you shared that with me and our listeners, because I just always assumed that once you get something into law, you're good. And it's just a matter of ensuring that there's a mechanism to enforce it, which was the bigger concern, right? That the Environmental Justice Office is dismantled. You're laying off staff at the EPA, you're laying off staff at the CDC, you're laying off staff at all these agencies so that you undermine their ability to enforce the laws that are within their sphere of influence. But then now you're saying that the president can just tell the Department of Justice, hey, we know the law is there. We know they're complaining about people breaking the law. Just ignore that and do something else instead and not enforce what is currently required by law to be done in those situations of injustice. That's very alarming. And I wasn't prepared for that when we started talking.
Well, what I can say is that, states still, federal aid recipients still have an obligation to actually not discriminate in the use of federal funding. So I think that's a bright light, that those federal aid recipients that are of the mind that they should actually comply with the existing statute and the regulations, that they can still do that. Like, so while there is a threat to the regulations, there's still a requirement for the federal aid recipient to actually not discriminate. Like, they have a directive on the front end to do what all of that they can to not make decisions that have a discriminatory impact. And I mean, I think on a note that is more proactive, less defensive. I mean, the fact is that plaintiffs can still file lawsuits under our environmental laws to actually improve environmental conditions where they are. So if we step aside from the civil rights laws, which I do think are incredibly important to achieving environmental justice, equally as important are the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, RCRA, Superfund. Like, we still have federal environmental laws that have to be complied with, and we still have state laws that have to be complied with. And then there are some venues that are going to be venues that are better for plaintiffs than others. And that's where I think, as an organization, we are looking at what are the venues that are going to be most helpful for doing work to protect communities and to prevent additional harm. And communities still can comment in public processes about, projects that they know are maybe bad for them. They can continue to do their own monitoring of air quality. They can still make complaints when when there's too much dust, when they see something wrong with a creek in their community. They can still complain to state regulators. State regulators still have responsibility, environmental protection responsibilities, and communities can still organize. So there are a lot of threats that are out there, but there's still so much action that people can take to protect themselves, to prevent additional harm.
Wow. Wow. Well, I'm glad you're doing that work, and I'm glad that you have a team behind you that's pushing for all this to be done, because, I mean, you're fighting for things I didn't even realize were problems and issues. And so I'm definitely excited about that. We hit an hour. I don't know how much time you have left to talk. I do want to spend some time just understanding how we can support the work that you're doing, how we can be a part of all that you have going on, how we can engage listeners, people like me who are just learning this for the first time. How can we get involved with what you're doing?
So definitely, please check out Plantations to Pollution, Black Communities, Legacy Pollution, The Path Forward. Please go to the website. Please support environmental justice organizations. They're, like, whether that's with volunteer time, whether it's financial support. I will say that environmental justice organizations have always been under-resourced and are under even more pressure now because of the rollback and federal funding that was meant to provide support to help achieve these outcomes. Definitely getting engaged on these issues to protect our bedrock environmental and civil rights laws. So that is engaging with decision makers, whether that's members of Congress or on the state level, where there are opportunities to, sometimes there's some opportunities to support environmental justice legislation, environmental justice, executive action. In North Carolina and Virginia, those opportunities are available. Making sure to engage in local zoning decisions. Being able to connect, again, the prior harm to current present day injustices, to understand how redlining of Black communities resulted in disinvestment, and now there's blight in these communities. Understanding those connections and then taking action in in your own community, supporting groups that are doing environmental justice work. That I think those are ways that you can get involved. And we always appreciate people supporting the Southern Environmental Law Center. We provide our services at no cost. And that's from our representation to consultants to experts. We're providing that service free of charge to community organized communities, to other nonprofits. So that's who we are supporting. So this, to support SELC to do that work, it is in turn supporting those community groups. So support the community groups directly, and if you so choose, support SELC as we do this work to achieve environmental justice.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. If so, for the community leaders listening, if they see a need and they want to engage your services, what's the best way to do that? Is there a particular form they fill out? Is there a place they go on the website to ask for some help? Like, how does that work?
Right. Yeah. Like people get in touch with, like people call us, like people can just call the organization and say, here's what the issue is. And that call gets routed to the subject matter expert at the organization to determine whether or not the issue area is within our expertise. Is it something that we can take on? So people can reach out, yeah, directly to SELC through our website or through calling one of our offices, one of our 9 offices.
I know, all across the South. And so, before you go, don't leave yet. I always give our guests a couple of minutes at the end to just share with us whatever you want us to know, however you're feeling about the way things are going, what you think is most important for us to leave with after this conversation. What is that thing that when I turn off this recording, when I end this podcast, you want me to remember from our conversation today?
One thing I want everyone to remember is that, we still have very powerful tools to help us get to the ends that we want to get to protect communities, to protect public health. We can still file citizen suits. We can still comment in public processes. We can still ask for public information. We can file Freedom of Information Act requests. We can file public records requests, because sunshine is the best disinfectant. We want to shine a light on what is happening, and we want to be aware. So we can still do that. There are lots of data and mapping tools that are still available for people to find out, like, what is happening in their community. Are there underground storage tanks? Are there urban heat islands? What are the issues that are in community? There are still mapping tools that are available for that. We still have environmental justice tools in some of our states that we want to rely on. I want people to also know that there is strength in numbers, that organizing is always going to be an incredibly effective tool to get good outcomes. I do want people to think about history as context for the present, and be inspired to act in the ways that you think are going to be most effective to get some progress in environmental protection and public health. But more voices is more attention, and think about sharing resources, whether that's money, whether that's expertise, whether that's experience, and engage with media, learn about what these issues are, stay connected through news outlets, and make sure that you're speaking up on the issues that matter to you in coalition with others. So those are some things that I would like to leave the audience with. And this is we're in a time that I think is temporary. There'll be a change in tide. So while we may be playing defense right now, there's still something to fight for. So I think to stay encouraged while we get to another day that is brighter.
Oh, that's perfect. That's perfect. And so, with that, Chandra, I want to thank you again for joining us on the podcast. Thank you for your expertise, for your advocacy, and for your hard work. 'Cause I know it's hard work doing what you do day in and day out, fighting the good fight. My mom says doing the Lord's work. And so I appreciate you, and thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today.
Thank you so much for spending so much time with me. Your patience and your good questions. I really enjoyed the time together. I appreciate it.
No, it was my pleasure. And so with that, I want to thank you all for listening to another episode of the Environmental Justice Lab podcast, where we are for the people and the planet. We'll see you next time.